Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you my definitive review of the Samyang AF 135mm F1.8. This is a review that I have been getting requests to do all year, and for a while there I had lost contact with the Samyang organization and just wasn't really getting anywhere, but thankfully I've got a new contact there and they have been sending me lenses for testing once again, and so I'm really excited to have spent time with this lens because frankly it's been the Samyang lens that I have been probably personally most excited about in the last several years. Almost 8 years ago, I did a review of the Samyang manual focus 135mm f2. And while that lens had a long list of shortcomings, the build quality was mediocre at best, and in the copy I had, there were some things that were a little bit stiff and didn't quite work the way that they should. And of course, at that point, reviewing manual lenses on DSLRs, not really a great platform for manual focus. But despite that, I came away quite positive about the lens because it had such amazing image quality. It really exceeded my expectations, and it blew away, for example, the Canon 135mm f2L that I was using optically, and was pretty close to competing with the Zeiss Apo Sonar 135mm f2. So it was a really exceptional lens. Fast forward to today, and we've got an autofocusing lens that comes with none of the baggage, but an even wider maximum aperture of f1.8 and an even better image quality performance. This lens is a true competitor to what I consider to be one of the very best lenses on the Sony platform, which is, of course, the 135mm f1.8 G Master. So how can a lens that costs less than half of the G Master compete so well? Well, that's what we're going to explore as a part of today's review. First, however, a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So as noted, this lens has come a long way from where we were in the build quality of the manual focusing lens. Now, Samyang has what they call a tiny series, and those lenses I really love, and I've spent time with them. Very compact. This lens is not part of the tiny series. I would consider this to be more of kind of their professional series of lenses with larger maximum apertures, more features, and of course, a bigger build. This is not a small lens. However, as we're going to see, it is, while it's as big as competitors, it's not quite as heavy as them. And so this lens is 93.4 millimeters in diameter, or about 3.7 inches. It has an 82mm front filter thread, which is shared with both the GM and the Sigma Art Series lens. And then the overall length of the lens is right under 130 millimeters, or 5.1 inches. It weighs in at 772 grams, or 27 ounces. But as mentioned, it is lighter than the competitors. It is about 180 grams lighter than the G Master. The Sigma, which of course is a ported over DSLR lens, and so I suspect that Sigma will probably have a dedicated DN version in the future that'll be smaller and lighter. At the moment, however, the Sigma's pretty huge, and it weighs a good 400 grams heavier than what this lens does at this point. This lens comes as a part of what Samyang is calling their Series 2, and that is what applies to kind of their professional grade lenses. And for most part, they're called Series 2 because they are the second generation of their lenses covering those focal lengths. That's not the case here, but it is using the same kind of design language and features. And by the way, I really do like this new design language from Samyang, and I was actually quite delighted to see how nicely it scaled up to a larger lens like this, where the language, I think, still looks really modern, very clean. And of course, it is now considerably more feature-rich than what Samyang lenses have been in the past. That starts with on the inside with weather sealing at 7 different seal points, giving it a more professional grade of weather sealing. It also has a number of features that are competitive with, other lenses, which include the focus hold button. They have their own kind of custom button here, which allows you to program the functionality of the actual manual focus ring. And so in my case, I've got it in mode 1 to where it functions as an aperture ring. If I go into mode 2, it automatically switches to manual focus. And so it essentially serves as a AF/MF switch as well. And then in this case, we've also got a focus limiter, a 3-position focus limiter, so you can either eliminate distant focus or close focus. In this case, it might be useful to use that in some cases, because as we're going to see, autofocus isn't quite as snappy as what the G Master is. And so I have reached for it for a few times also to kind of make sure that the lens, if I'm wanting to shoot very close subjects, to keep them steady there. And so that can be a useful thing. Another kind of unique feature to the Samyang, one that is shared with the tiny series 24mm F1.8, is a dedicated astrophotography function. So that has 2 different pieces here that add up to the total. And first of all, if you hold down the focus hold button while the power is off, then turn on the camera, it will go into this astrophotography mode. So what it does is it focuses to a pre-calibrated distance that should be proper for astrophotography. And if it's not, if you look in the description down below to my written review, I have the instructions from Samyang on how to tweak that to make sure that it's perfectly accurate. But it does 2 things when you do that. As mentioned, it focuses to that preset position. It puts the lens into manual focus mode at that point to make sure that it holds it. And then also there is a little focus indicator on the side of the lens near the lens mount that will show green when it is at that proper focus distance. And if you move it away from that, it will stop showing green. It will show more of an amber color to let you know that it is no longer in that preset calibrated position. It does work. I did have to calibrate in the copy just to get it just a little bit closer to what I wanted. I'm also shooting in very cold conditions right now, which can sometimes tweak that just a little. The difference of the thermal pressures there will change things a little bit. But anyway, it is a very useful feature, and this is a lens, as we're going to see, that works quite well for astrophotography work. Now, I will note with all of these features, if you're wanting to tweak them, at least as far as some of the behavior of, you can also change like the focus ring speed and how the custom button works if you want to do firmware updates, which I will note that as of a few days ago, we're up to firmware 4 on this lens. So Samyang does update their firmware. And so, but unfortunately, all of these at this point require a separate accessory called the Samyang Lens Station. And then there's a free piece of software that works along with that. It is my hope that for the future that Samyang moves to a standard that we've seen from some other manufacturers at this point of integrating a USB-C port either right into the lens or the rear lens cap. And so making that kind of a part of the design rather than a separate accessory. And I think that maybe is a logical progression for them at this point. As noted about the manual focus ring, is you can tweak the behavior of it, but the focus ring itself is really, really nice. It's very nice and wide. It has a nice grip texture to it. It is well damped, and for a focus by wire lens, it is very responsive. You can do really nice focus pulls with it, and so that is nice to see. If we look inside, there are 11 aperture blades, which keeps a circular shape, as you can see as you open and close the aperture. It also does a nice job with the bokeh geometry, with keeping a good circular shape, but also the lens itself has pretty nice geometry around the edges of the frame. One final thing to note about the build and the design is that this has a really good minimum focus distance of 69 centimeters, and that gives a nice high 0.24 times magnification. So that allows you to get some really nice close-up shots where you can completely blur out the background. Very, very useful for that purpose. I will note that it focuses a little closer than the GM, but the GM has ever so slightly 1% higher magnification, which tells me there's probably a little bit of focus breathing going on with the Samyang that doesn't go on with the GM. So all told, that while the build quality is not at the superlative professional grade level of the G Master lens, this is a nicely built lens, and again, it strikes the nice balance of having good features and build quality while also keeping the weight a little bit more moderate, which I appreciate. Autofocus here comes via a linear STM focus motor. Now, this is, I think, the main point of differentiation between the Samyang and the G Master, because the G Master has dual linear focus motors at the front and the back of the focusing groups. And so as a byproduct, it's got more torque to work with, it focuses faster. I did note a difference, not so much in the minor focus changes like when shooting portraits, but I did note that the Samyang is a little bit slower when I'm making a major focus change, going from a close subject to a distant subject, for example. Just a little bit more lag, though for the most part, autofocus is quite snappy, and I primarily shoot in AFC, and it works very well in AFC mode. I found that when I was actually doing some of my focus test where I was shooting in a controlled environment, then in some cases I actually got a little bit better focus results in that setting than what I did with the G Master. But I also know from using the G Master, if I'm trying to track sports action, it is exceptionally good. Samyang is not quite on that level. And so that's the main differentiator. I think that for most people that are shooting portraits or weddings or other things you do with a 135mm lens, it'll work just fine for all of those things. But if you want to shoot sports and you're looking for 135mm focal length and this fast maximum aperture, I think that the GM is probably worth the additional money in that narrow set of circumstances. I also found that IAF worked very well for me. I shot on both the A7 IV and then the Alpha 1. I got very good focus results on human and animal subjects. I also was pleasantly surprised when it came to the focus pulls for video work. They actually were a little bit faster than what I've seen with a couple of the other recent Samyang Series 2 lenses, and so they felt quite responsive. And then also, as you can see when I did my hand test, there's really no lag or hesitation in making that transition from my hand back to my eye, and snaps back and forth smoothly but quickly. And so everything there was good overall. If I didn't have the GM as a comparison, I would say that autofocus is fantastic, but GM is next level when it comes to autofocus performance, mostly when it comes to the speed and the amount of torque that is available. Where the GM does not really have an advantage, surprisingly, is when it comes to image quality. If we look at the MTF charts from both of the lenses, we see that both of them are incredibly good. The GM shows a tiny bit more in the center of the frame. The Samyang shows a little bit more along the edges of the frame. We'll dive in, however, and take a closer look at the overall image quality. Also know, however, I will be doing one of my head-to-head versus episodes where I dive into that a little bit more deeply in the future, so stay tuned for that. Let's dive in and take a look at IQ.
So first of all, as you can see, when it comes to vignette and distortion, both of these are pretty close to non-existent. Distortion, there's just really nothing to correct. It's within such a small percentage that you really can't correct anything without it being overcorrected. And when it comes to the vignette, I dialed in only a plus 28, which is basically about a stop. And so vignette is pretty much non-existent here. Take a look at this shot, for example, and we'll come back to this in just a moment for another reason, but there's been no correction for vignette here. And if you look down in this right corner, which is, a nice bright area, you can see that it is not, marred by vignette really at all. And so if anything, you probably will end up adding more vignette into like portrait shots than what you will take it away here. Also very impressive is the control of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. We can see if we zoom in here that, number one, everything is very black. And then, transition to white. There's very little fringing before or after the plane of focus. So even if I'm shooting very shiny surfaces at f1.8, as you can see here, contrast is just brilliant, detail is brilliant. And then as you look towards kind of the transition towards defocus, even in these really shiny metal areas, very little CA there at all. And as you transition to the defocused area, it's just completely neutral. Likewise with bokeh circles, number one, you can see how big and how soft they are. Very, very nice. And if I look in here, even at a pixel level, there is the tiniest halo of fringing there, but really not enough to be objectionable at all. Likewise, in this shot of just dry grasses, but with really direct sun coming right through them, you can see that not only is there no fringing there, but as we look towards the area that's out of focus, there's no fringing back there either. So a really impressive longitudinal chromatic aberration performance. Likewise, even stop down and looking at the edge of the frame, there is very little lateral chromatic aberration. Once again, our transitions from black to white is very, very smooth without any, chromatic aberrations that are marring there towards the edge of the frame. So very strong once again. So let's take a look at resolution in contrast. The MTF charts are impressive. We'll see if that bears out in my actual testing. And so here we're using the 50 megapixel Sony Alpha 1, 200% magnification. Center of the frame, you can see this lens is impressively sharp. Great detail, great contrast, looks fantastic. Mid-frame also looks really excellent, very strong contrast. And if we go right down into the corners look exceptionally good as well. A incredibly consistent performance across the frame. So how does that compare to the very high-end and very expensive Sony 135mm G Master? We'll break this down more in an actual head-to-head comparison video, but taking a look at the two side by side, we can see that I would say that the GM has an ever so slight advantage in the center of the frame. I don't know that you would see it unless they were side by side. But basically, once you move out of there really is no GM advantage that is left. In fact, as we get down towards the corners, the Samyang is just a little bit better contrast and performance there. This image shot at, higher ISO, 1600, and, just a kind of casual shot, but it shows off just how sharp the Samyang is. You can just see how much contrast is there and just rendering of all of these fine details on Ferrari's face. Just really impressively sharp. So if we stop down a little bit to f2, is there any improvement to be seen? In the center of the frame, there is just a marginal amount more contrast there. Likewise, if we move off to the mid-frame, it's very similar. Already was so strong to begin with. I would say that here in the corners, we see just a little bit of improvement when it comes to the contrast and just a little bit brighter in the corner. But, I mean, it's really popping already. It's exceptionally sharp. If we throw in f2.8, we can see that there is now a little bit more punch in the center of the frame. It is looking, pretty much perfect there. Likewise, mid-frame, we'll take a look at a few other spots over here. You can just see that contrast is higher still. Looking up into this other corner, exceptionally sharp. Take a look at the Queen once again, and everything just looking really crisp. Just detail is fantastic everywhere you look in the frame. Let's skip on to landscape apertures, f5.6. In the center of the frame, I wouldn't say that I see any further improvement. I think we have already reached pretty much peak performance. Maybe a hair more in the mid-frame, and corners already looked fantastic. They look, just slightly fantasticer. That's not even a word, but I mean, it is just brilliantly sharp. Just to give you an idea of how that plays out in the real world, here in this image, you can see that just looking at the detail everywhere, it is just, fantastic. You can just kind of move around in this image. You can just see that there's just a fabulous amount of fine details that are rendered even at this distance. It's just a really impressive optical instrument. So as you move on to f16 and then f22, we'll see that diffraction is going to start to play a little bit of havoc here in terms of our overall contrast. You can see it's starting to muck things up a bit. And that is just, that's the nature of physics. You can't change that. But this is a pretty brilliantly sharp lens, that even when kind of really damaged by diffraction here, there's many lenses I look at that corner performance and say, yeah, that's really fantastic. But this lens is just so good that it even holds up to diffraction reasonably well. So not only do we have high magnification, but we can see that if we look up close, the lens holds up really well up close with great contrast and great detail. That makes it really useful for up close work. For example, here's just an out-of-camera JPEG, and you can see, number one, that we have got, really nice levels of detail there, and also a high level of magnification. Another shot here, and, this is zoomed into a pixel level, but you can see just how nice the performance is. That really adds to the versatility of a lens like this. So that really great bokeh rendering helps, with pretty decent geometry towards the edge of the frame. It just makes shots like this really, fun to do. You can see the great detail that is there, but then also that, combination of both great detail and then also really great bokeh is fantastic. And that just means that one of my favorite things for a 135mm lens is the ability to shoot full body portraits and to really have such shallow depth of field. And you can see that the background, is melting away. You can put foreground objects. I was shooting through grasses here, but you can see how lovely it is on the subject. So it just gives you a lot of versatility. Here, from quite a distance away from my subject, we can just see, however, that even shooting at a smaller aperture, this is at f2.8, that still the background just really blurs away from the combination of the focal length and then the large maximum aperture. And of course, that would be even more dramatic if I was shooting at f1.8. We'll look at a couple other metrics here real quick, and that has to do with flare resistance. So obviously, again, high contrast situation. Detail's all really good, but we can see that there is a little bit of a ring around this really bright light. Probably many people will not find that off-putting, find it, have a little bit of charm, but it is something I want to point out. I did shoot in other backlit situations here, and you can see that there's a little bit of that ring with the sun shooting through into this particular image. You can also see that flare resistance is not all that bad. It's actually held up here nicely, and so we've got beautiful detail and contrast on our subject, beautifully creamy background, and it's also handling that, that flare pretty well. Now, of course, as mentioned already, this lens is touted some for its astrophotography work, so I wanted to test that. And first of all, in the center of the frame, star points really, really crisp. As we move off to the edge of the frame, star points also really crisp. Very little evidence of coma. The low vignette of the lens is also very helpful. I typically look more at wide-angle lenses for doing night sky work. I just find, for one thing, you can put a lot more context in there for more interesting images. But, of course, if you're actual goal is to actually magnify some celestial bodies, that obviously is a longer focal length is more useful for that. So in this case, I think this is Mars that shows up really nice and bright. And, you can see other points that with a wide angle lens wouldn't be magnified nearly to the same degree. And so it can be useful for that type of work.
So as you can see, this is an exceptional optical instrument. This is, I would say, the best lens Samyang has ever made optically, and frankly, it is one of the best lenses on the Sony platform optically. And for the price point of under $1,000 US, I think that this is the best image quality that you're going to find, period. At the end of the day, anytime that I do a 135mm lens review, and that includes the G Master, or the Zeiss Mills 135mm f2, these are all lenses that I have really, really loved. The problem with 135mm is that it is not as flexible as shorter focal lengths that are common for portraiture like 85mm or 50mm. It's just long enough that you have to have a little bit more working room. So while it does work really, really nice for head and shoulders shots, particularly because you can focus so closely, it gives you some versatility there. Where a lens like this really, really shines is when you're a little bit further away and you're shooting full body portraits, environmental type portraits where you can make backgrounds kind of melt away, and there's this unique look to it that is only bettered really by the rare 200mm f2 lens out there. And as a byproduct of that, it is a lens that I always love the images from 135mm lenses, but I don't end up reaching for them quite as often as I do a 50mm or an 85mm lens, for that simple reason that it is a little bit less flexible. At the same time, if you are convinced that 135mm is what you're looking for and you own a Sony camera, this lens is pretty much a no-brainer. As I said, unless you're shooting sports, there's little reason to move on to the G Master lens when this lens is so good and it costs more than $1,000 less. At the end of the day, that makes the Samyang AF 135mm f1.8 a winner, and in my case, a lens worth waiting for. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. There's also an image gallery there with a lot of great looking images, if I say so myself. And beyond that, there are buying links if you want to purchase one. There's linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, or to get channel merchandise. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.